Welcome back. We're now in public for our third item of business this morning, which is an evidence session on the Scottish Government's draft climate change plan. This sets out how the Government intends to meet its carbon emissions reduction targets. The committee is leading a cross-committee effort to scrutinise the draft plan, and the Scottish Government has said that it will lay the final plan before the Parliament is dissolved at the end of March. Everyone giving evidence today will be contributing towards a report we will publish in late February with a debate following in the Chamber. I'd like to welcome to the meeting Professor Adrian Davies, the Transport Research Institute for Edinburgh Napier University, Professor Rachel Allred, Westminster University, Lamek Solomon, Head of Decarbonisation Policy, Logistics UK, and Sarah Collier, the Senior Public Affairs Manager for the Confederation of Passenger Transport. Thank you all for attending this morning. This session will cover all the main aspects of the transport sector, although I do note we discussed electric vehicles and charging points with a panel on the 16th of December. So that bit, I feel, has probably been largely covered, although we may come back to it. Now, in the normal way on this committee, I get to ask the introductory questions, which are meant to be a gentle warmer into the bank to give you each a chance to say what you think. So my first question is, are the policies set out in the draft climate change plan sufficient to deliver the Scottish Government's overarching goals for car use reduction and modal shift, including the freight sector? Now, the answer could be yes or no, but I suspect you want to give a bit more than that. But I just remind you that there was 4 of you, and so if somebody says something that somebody else has said, it would be better just to say, I agree with so-and-so, rather than repeating it all, just because the time is of the essence. So, Adrian, do you want to start off with that?
Yes, good morning, everyone, and thank you for inviting me. I will be short on this one, because I know you have been given evidence by many others before. So the answer is no, and it's no because there is no real substance to this plan on transport. It's very, very weak. We see in the whole of the 160 pages of the document in Annex 2, the word encouragement appears 50 times. It appears most times in the transport section, and most times within the transport section to do with road transport rather than shipping or aviation. So the emphasis is on encouragement, and we know from the best robust science that encouragement alone is not enough. I will briefly say electric vehicles also on their own, they've been overemphasised to the detriment of behaviour change, and behaviour change requires strong action from government through the local authorities to put in measures which make it safer for people to actively choose and want to use public transport, walking and cycling, and it needs disincentivisation of the use of private motor cars where there are alternatives. And the emphasis, as has been stated in previous plans, which I agree with, is that most of the action lies in urban areas where the opportunity is greatest. Thank you.
Okay, Sarah.
Thanks, Convener. I know you said not to mention outside those 2 outcomes, but can I just mention the transport outcome on all road vehicles, zero emission by 2040, just because you didn't, talk about kind of coaches and buses at your last session. So I would just want to mention that one, yeah. I think we're quite happy with that outcome and the policies under that. That will, yeah, I think that's fine. I'll maybe be a bit more positive than Adrian. I certainly would agree with him. The car use reduction outcome and the policies and proposals under that do not seem sufficient and kind of they lack a lot of detail. I think on the modal shift, I was a bit more encouraged by what I read. I think, again, a lot of the detail was very buried in Appendix 3, and it was right at the end of Appendix 3, and it did take me more than one read to actually realise where the detail was on what was a policy, what was a proposal, what was an enabling policy, an enabling proposal, etc. But yeah, I was I would say fairly encouraged by that. I think it echoes a lot of what we have been saying as an organisation and as part of the workshops that have been held by the Government and Transport Scotland as part of this plan. That it is a package. It's not just about free bus travel. It's not just about bus infrastructure, although that is the big one for us. It's about a package, and I think the modal shift outcome, the proposals and policies under that do reflect what we've been saying on that. So I'm a bit more encouraged by that, but I do agree that it's a plan, but it needs to move towards a delivery plan and proposal. So it needs a lot more detail. But I'm, tentatively happy with what's under certainly the modal shift outcome.
Okay, Laymack.
Sorry? Oh, sorry.
No, that's right. Laymack, can you hear me?
Oh, apologies. Sorry. Yes, I can hear you. So I will echo what everyone has said so far on the detail. I think from what we've heard from our members, actually the support for modal shift doesn't actually reflect the operational reality. So what we've found is that recent funding decisions need to align with policy. So the emphasis on rail and water freight must be matched by that long-term funding. And again, we've seen recent reduction in support for modal shift schemes. So the MRSS was removed from the Scottish budget 2 budgets ago, so that was support for up to £700,000. We've seen subsidies for timber transportation by Water in Scotland also reduced. So again, we find that there is a lot of ambition being portrayed in these climate drafts, but then the funding isn't there. The parallel funding or adjacent funding isn't there to actually support this. So we need to ensure that the funding does align with the policy ambitions of what we're asking for.
Okay. Sorry, I was looking up something on my papers to make sure that I got the right bit on it. Thank you for that. And I'm just going to come on to Rachel. Sorry, Rachel.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me here. I won't repeat what other people have said, but yes, like Adrian, I was disappointed by the kind of underwhelming nature of the transport aspects of this document. It's very focused around electrification, which is obviously important, but the substantial potential role for demand reduction just really seems to be kind of sidelined. And I think there isn't really a sense of the transformational nature of change that is required and necessary to really reap the benefits of demand reduction, of modal shift. And I think there are some great examples. We know what to do. We know that we need push and pull policies. We need to use pricing. We need to use reducing road space available for private motor vehicles. We need substantial investment in public and active travel. But there are really good examples from across Europe, from North America and so on, including in rural areas, including in hilly areas, including in areas that have, particularly bad weather and so on. So I think really there is a lot of scope for change, but I don't really see it in the document. I do, targets, very often targets are set that are then missed, that are not monitored and so on. But I think we really need targets on car use reduction, targets on modal shift that can be monitored at a local level. That, for instance, there's a good example in terms of what Transport for London does with the London boroughs, that targets are monitored at borough level, every couple of years. And therefore it's possible to have an overview of which are going in the right direction, which are going in the wrong direction, and action can be taken. And I think that's what we need in terms of targets. Thanks.
Okay, so just drilling down a little bit into the draft climate change plan, I was looking at Annex 2 and the sectorial changes. If you turn to page 51, when it comes to transport, it says, in order to achieve our net zero targets in relation to the transport sector, action will be required to be taken by all members of society, from the general public, businesses, public sector organisations, as well as all levels of government, which seems to be a call to arms. Then if you turn to Annex 3 and go to page 28, and you look at the total cost for achieving net zero in the transport sector, we're looking at about a gross cost of about 12.7 billion and a net cost of 6.9 billion. So could somebody just help me if I've missed something from your reading of it? Who's paying the 12.7 billion, and where's it coming from, and where's it going? Does anyone want to Wait, on the basis you've all read the thing, Adrian, do you want to have a go at that?
Not really, no. I mean, the responsibility is everyone's, but it is responsibility of government to set the frame for it, and that means it needs to understand the cost benefits and the losses that will occur if we continue the way we are. For example, if I just try and answer this in some meaningful way, if we look at the targets for active travel, the active travel targets were to increase active travel funding to at least 10% of the overall transport budget by 24-25. Failed. Less than 50% of that has been achieved, and it's declined in the last year. So what's happened as a result of that, you could argue, if we look at the long term, will be that less people have the opportunity to reduce their carbon emissions because there isn't the infrastructure there for them or their children to cycle to school or walk to school or whatever. They're not safe or don't feel safe, so they drive their children to school. Those things have huge knock-on effects down the line for the Scottish Government and for governments in general in terms of the work that needs to be done to ameliorate the impacts of climate change. So whichever way you want to stack it up, government has to be able to invest money along with others, and that doesn't mean including with businesses. But principally, it has to take the lead. So I'm sorry, Convener, that's a roundabout answer to say that we have to do the things now and put up the costs up front, whoever's paying for it, because as Kevin Watkins made it very clear on December 16, we are in for a catastrophic future if we don't do action fast.
I'm not disputing your thought process on that. What I'm trying to work out is there's £12.7 billion identified of costs that needed to be made. I'm trying to work out where they're coming from and where the savings, the net costs, are going to be made, i.e. the 6 billion. Now, 6.7 or 6.9 billion is not going to be achieved by active travel.
Could I come back to, just briefly? So this might jump into the whole thing about co-benefits, which I know is one of the agenda items. So one of the things about active travel, and I'll say that also in the same breath with public transport, particularly bus use and the amount of walking that you need involved in that, that we know very, very clearly from the science that if you are able to increase the amount of active travel, you will reduce the disease burden on the National Health Service and on society generally and total well-being. That will have a cost saving down the line, which is pretty substantial. It has been termed that it's the greatest opportunity in the current century to improve public health by the irony that climate change should force us to decarbonise, which means we transfer from using fossil fuel energy to more calorific energy. So actually we get the health benefits, and there are some very substantial benefits to savings to health services from that.
That have to be at 6.9
yes, there
billion
would,
pounds.
But there are.
Well, that's the assessment. I'm trying to work out where the figures are. Okay. As somebody interested in figures and how they come about. Do you want to answer? Is the industry? How much is the industry going to come up with of that £12.9 billion? I think you're live. Are you live? No, I can't. I can't hear you. Hold on.
Apologies, I was unable to unmute.
Can I just say, I'm just checking this with broadcasting. My understanding is that broadcasting will unmute you. Is that right?
For me, I think because I've joined via a browser, I need to unmute myself. But I didn't have the
understand that.
Available.
Okay, I was going to say normally because broadcasting unmute you, and if you then push the unmute button at the same time, you mute yourself. But because you're coming in a different way, I apologise. Yes, you need to unmute yourself. We can now hear you. Go for it.
Brilliant. And I think we had this discussion. I know you had this discussion on electrification earlier, but I think I really do want to reiterate that, again, we think our members say a lot of the funding should come from government because they are making the initial investment on the vehicles. Our our research has found that eHGVs in particular are double the price of a diesel counterpart, and hydrogen HGVs are 3 times the price of a electric, so 6 times the price of a diesel. So again, they are making a lot of upfront investment. And again, the price parity between energy costs and diesel is very substantive. So again, the electrification ambitions really outpace the infrastructure readiness. So the plan places very strong emphasis on electrification, but freight-specific infrastructure such as high-capacity grid connections, depot charging, HGV-suitable public charging is not yet in place at scale or speed required. So without addressing these constraints, again, a lot of these emission targets will be difficult to deliver, and there hasn't been that investment to match that pace of the timeline set out in this plan. Again, as I mentioned earlier as well, there was a lot of emphasis on modal shift, but again, a lot of the funding for that has been reduced or removed. So there seems to be a lot of lip service and policy intent, but there isn't the adjacent or parallel funding to support that movement for industry. And they are making a lot of investment on their end, and they want to be met halfway from government.
Okay, Rachel, do you want to add anything on where all the money's coming from and where the savings are being made?
Yeah, sure. I mean, obviously, this isn't a plan that any of us produce, but in terms of talking about costs and benefits, as Adrian says, you know, the benefits of a substantial increase in active and public transport are really great. They're health benefits, and they can be, when they're quantified, they are very large. Personally, I would say that, you know, having people living longer, healthier lives, less road injuries and so on, less pollution-related, less physical and activity-related illness is a good thing, you know, regardless of exactly how it's monetized. But that always, when there's cost benefit analysis done, for instance, as I've been involved in looking at the impact of active travel schemes, the health benefits always are very large, and that's due to the monetization of additional healthy life years. Okay,
and I understand you didn't write the plan, but you come to this with a huge amount of knowledge, and we're expecting everyone to read the plan and understand the plan and sign up to it. That's what we're looking to do. So if we can't understand the costs or identify it, it makes it more difficult for them. Sarah, do you want to have a go at that?
Just to say, I think the SPICE assessment made the same points, so I'd imagine your committee report will go back and say, I mean, one of the areas where they have, I think, been able to kind of map out some of the costs is in the kind of spend on concessionary bus travel, and that's a weighty sum. That's over £400 million a year, potentially more in future years. So I think that's been, you know, that will add up to quite a lot of that 12.7 billion, won't it? But it has been explained that that's not just a kind of transport spend. That's about cost of living. You know, if you give people free transport, they'll spend it on something else in that area. So that's one area where they have been able to, I think, map out a cost. But it is kind of cross area. So,
okay, thank you. I think the next questions come from Mark. I think you're up there.
Yeah, thanks. I think one of the challenges we've got, particularly in this committee, is trying to scrutinise this plan. Very short period of time, 120 days that it's in front of Parliament. So, what I'm interested in is really what is missing from this plan. The government could go back to this plan after 120 days and say, do you know what, there's a point here, we've had evidence to show that this intervention, that intervention, this policy, that policy would make sense and would help to deliver the targets in a more effective way. So I'm interested particularly in terms of modal shift, whether you think there are very specific things that are missing from the plan in its draft stage at the moment, and particularly in relation to, you know, what local authorities can do, what national government can do, budgets, changes in legislation, how do we create the environment which really gets that modal shift, particularly in urban areas, not to exclude rural areas, but particularly where we've got that, you know, massive population and we can get those health benefits. So, yeah, I just sort of invite you to sort of come back in again briefly and just maybe identify a couple of things that you think are clearly missing at the moment, or maybe you think it's all here, it's just about emphasis. Sarah, do you want to come
as I
first?
said, I was quite encouraged by the kind of list of policies and proposals. One that kind of definitely jumped out is a new policy to develop and deliver a trunk road bus priority. But what I felt was missing from that is it seemed to be kind of very long time, and it was assigned to kind of carbon budget 4. And I wondered why would it take so long for any kind of for that to make a difference. So I feel like a bit more on that. And then there's a kind of existing policy on bus infrastructure, because there's an existing bus infrastructure fund, but then there's a suggested new enabling proposal around multi-year funding, both for bus priority and for active and sustainable travel. So I kind of want to understand a bit more, is that a separate thing? Are we going to do it differently? Just a bit more detail on that. And then I think what's missing is the kind of, the sticks, isn't it? The kind of like, how are we going to, disincentivise? And I think there's a crossover between car use reduction and modal shift there, but it's not explicitly referred to, certainly in the modal shift section. That's all about sort of doing good things, not the bad things.
Yeah. Can we go online? Lamech, do you want to come in?
Yeah. So in terms of what's missing, and what we hear a lot from our members, was they really did, really appreciate the modal shift revenue support scheme. So again, this was administered by DfT, so it is GB wide, UK wide, and Westminster did do it. So in England, this scheme does exist, but it was only removed in Scotland. This was done 2 budgets ago, and again, it was worth £700,000, and it was designed to support that transfer of freight from road to rail and water. So again, helping cover the operational costs of modal shift services, so making them a bit more commercially viable. And again, there was no consultation when it was removed. There was no discussion with industry. So again, something like that would be much appreciated by the sector. And I guess in terms of the positives, so the freight facilities grant, again, is something that a programme, so capital investment, so £3 million, that the Scottish Government is using to help pay for infrastructure and equipment. So that enables that freight shift. But again, this is only a 1-year settlement based on funding, and it is a very short duration. And again, that may have constraints on that overall impact without those further funding commitments.
Thank you. Rachel?
Yes, thank you. I have a few things. I mean, just to pick up on Lamech's point there around funding settlements, one of the things that I found in research has been really important is to have, long-term substantial guaranteed funding settlements, in this case for active travel, but having local authorities have that certainty, have the funding that they need, and also know that it's not just going to end at the end of a year. But a few other things I wanted to say were, for instance, around electrification, that there's a trend for cars to be getting larger and heavier, and that is going to counteract positive impacts of electrification. And I would like to see policies around that, and policies disincentivising cars getting larger and heavier in terms of electric vehicles and vehicles more generally. I would like to see more on, for instance, e-bikes in particular, which could be really important in the Scottish context. For instance, in Switzerland, Lausanne had a policy of giving free e-cargo bikes to any residents who wanted them. These kind of levels of ambition I would like to see. Similarly, more about last mile freight, cargo bikes in cities. That could be quite important in terms of deliveries within cities, obviously not in rural areas in the same way, but within cities, and a strong steer on road space reallocation. And the fact that does combine push and pull policies, that if road space is removed from private motor vehicles and reallocated to walking, cycling, public transport, you get the disincentive to drive, and you also get the incentive to use those other modes. But obviously we know this is quite a difficult thing to do. It needs a strong steer. It needs support. But when you see, for instance, just to give one example about some research I've been recently doing, people may be aware that bike trips in London over 25 years have increased by a factor of 4. But in Paris, where road space reallocation has been much more substantial, they've increased by a factor of 40. So, we can see the scope for change. And there's examples also in more rural areas. There's examples in other European countries also. Thanks.
Thank you. Adrian?
Yes, so kind of following on from what Rachel's just said there, one of the things I want to like to introduce is that if we look at what has been the best experiment, if you like, trial of sustainable transport interventions in the whole of the UK. That was the Sustainable Travel Towns of Peterborough, Worcester and Darlington from 2004 to 2009, funded by the Department of Transport. And that, because it was a 5-year programme at least, Rachel's touched on the problems with 1-year funding, a 5-year trial brought about a 2% reduction overall in car use. It brought about 7 to 10% reduction in the number of car trips per resident. So it relied on multi-pronged, so that's a key point. It's not just one intervention. You need a multiple set of interventions. The ideal is probably up to 3 or 4 interventions at least. So it might be bus gates, it might be segregated cycle facilities, greater facilities for pedestrians like continuous footways, etc. It could be much more substantive implementations. But these were all trialled across 5 years. Now, the target that has been dropped by the Scottish Government of a 20% reduction target and replaced by a 4% reduction per year in the draft plan, simply on the evidence from the Sustainable Travel Towns, won't be sufficient. That's the best available evidence we've got from the UK. So in terms of what we call external validity in academia, can you transfer something to another place? Well, yes, you probably can from England to Scotland. It's not enough. What the target is not enough. The best available evidence on the types of measures, Mark, you mentioned that, are congestion charging, parking and traffic controls, and traffic zones, which includes what Rachel talked about with a very good example from Paris about road space reallocation. These are the interventions which give you most bangs for bucks in terms of reducing car use. If that's what we seek to do, those are the best sort of things. As was referred to at the beginning of this session, we don't suffer from a lack of good quality evidence. What we lack is the implementation of them. Thank you.
Thanks. Can I just ask you then what the role has been of travel planning, particularly with large institutions and employers in those case study examples? I mean, is travel planning something which national government, local government could be coordinating or requiring or mandating? And would that be an effective route to try and deliver these multi-pronged approaches to getting modal shift in the urban areas?
I think you're looking at me. Well, I would say that, and I would confess to being an author of studies for the Department of Transport in London in the past on travel plans by large organisations and in school travel plans as well. They can be very effective at reducing car use. One of the key examples of its age was Addenbrooke's Hospital in Cambridge, where essentially 110 car parking spaces were removed and a bus station put in place, which increased bus use to the hospital site enormously. I can't remember the figures off the top of my head. It was quite a while ago. That bus station is still there and in use. Many other intervention measures were including free bike availability and incentives, many incentives for staff. But the key thing I would come back to is that one item on its own, like a travel plan by an organisation, needs to be seen in the sum of a whole set of interventions across the local authority area and by the national government, because you need to be showing very clearly that we're heading in a certain direction and these things are synergetic. So the travel plan is very good. We've got good evidence from lots of different organisations, from small scale to large scale organisations, but they need to be contextually set within the frame of a national policy where we're very, very clear about why we're doing it and the speed at which we need to do it.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Sorry, I just want to, on the evidence that we've just heard so far, just to help sort of drag me back to the Highlands and Islands, which is an area that I do. I mean, we don't have the buses and the transport routes, and frankly, jumping on a bicycle, if I'd done that yesterday to get down here because there were no trains and there were no buses, I'd probably only have got as far as Aviemore by now. So my question is, how do we take this down to the people who are not the low-hanging fruit, who might be penalised by some of the suggested things within the thing? Sarah, do you want to go on that?
As in, how do we tackle this in rural areas?
Yeah,
Well,
how do we deal with it? Because it appears, if you look at the pinnacle or the sharp pointy end, which is going to be hit first by the climate change plan, it's private car use, which is what's used in the rural areas probably more than anything else, because there ain't anything else.
Yeah, well, I think that's why the kind of car use reduction policy is being kind of reconsidered, and it will be kind of dealt with at kind of RTP or a local authority level. And it is, I think your previous witnesses have said, it's the urban areas that we really need to kind of focus on in terms of modal shift. And in the rural areas, you know, it might be different things. So obviously in the Highlands and Islands, you're going to benefit from a £2 fare cap in the coming year. So there are buses in the Highlands and Islands, because otherwise why would we be having a fare cap there? So I think it's about doing different things in different areas. It's not one policy that in a very remote rural area would be the same as in Edinburgh.
But if we're phasing out private cars, which appears to be the direction of the plan,
I don't think
private cars are actually form the basis of a lot of rural people just to get to a hospital appointment.
Yeah, I think everybody recognises that, though, but I think sometimes it's unfortunately presented as a kind of a binary, and it's like, we're going to take your cars off you, or you can drive all you want. It's in the middle. It's more about kind of like, is there some journeys that you could make by bus instead of car, and that's maybe more likely in the urban areas. But in rural areas, there'll be some journeys that you can make. I mean, I was at a National Trust property at the weekend that was in a rural area, and they were giving a kind of discounted ticket if you arrived by bus, and there was a bus to get there. So I think it's not all about it's not all taking your car away from you, all or one. And I know sometimes it can be presented like that, sometimes in the media or potentially in Parliament. But I think we need to think about the middle rather than this or that.
And I kind of understand that, but I also understand the low-hanging fruit is the urban centres where buses and bicycling make more sense. In the same way that changing streets over for different use may make more sense. In rural areas, that doesn't make a lot of sense. And I think the fear is that people are going to be met. I just want to go back to a point that I made earlier. I'm completely confused because I went through the cost benefits and none of you challenged me on it, which I'm sure you would have looked at, because the figures I quoted to you was the non-cumulative cost benefit that the government's identified in Chapter 3. If you add them all up together, it comes to a figure of a cost benefit of 26 billion with a cost estimate of 12.7 billion. I'm interested that you didn't challenge me on it, because I was actually tripped myself up to see if you would find that was an area that you'd looked at. But you haven't really looked at the costs of this and you weren't able to challenge me on it. You've just accepted the figures, even though the figures I gave you were figures were incorrect. Does that not why would that give me confidence that what you're suggesting is going to be actually correct? Adrian, as you answered, I'm going to come to you first.
Well, I mean, I don't have the response to you on more than what I said earlier, Convener, about the costs and benefits that we've got to get on with this. I haven't looked in that much detail. I will give partly an excuse that I haven't had that much time to do that because of the pace of the preparation for this. But that's not a good enough excuse, probably. But I come back to the fact that it doesn't. What we need to do is what we need to do. The studies, Rachel Aldridge and I will know that when we've done studies of transport interventions, we get high benefit to cost ratios. So returns on investment are generally very high, not least because of the health benefits that accrue when you get people to be able to change their travel behaviour, which is largely what we need to do in urban areas. So I'm sorry, I'm not giving you your direct answer that you wished.
No, I'm just because I've struggled, probably like most people who've picked up this climate change plan, which is massive. And, you know, it formed a good part of my Christmas reading, which is probably a sorry state of affairs to be in. But I've looked at the figures and I can't make them work. And I'm interested that if I quoted figures at you, that you don't seem to be able to make them to work either. Maybe the government will understand. And Michael, do you want to come in? Sorry, Deputy Convener. Michael, would you like to come in?
Yeah, I just want to. I suspect this whole issue around preventative spend goes back to the Christie Commission and looking at trying to make that long-term investment in order to get wider societal benefits. And the problem very often is the political cycle doesn't really lend itself to that type of investment. And I was struck by Rachel's point about the need for long-term investment, which a couple of you have also made. The challenge which the Scottish Government will have is that it doesn't know where its budget is going to be next year, because its own budget is set effectively as a default from the UK Government's budget. So there is an issue about political process that actually compromises some of these issues. Which brings me to the question I'd like to ask Adrian and Rachel in particular. And that was that you don't feel that the transport provisions within the climate change plan are sufficient in order to meet the type of reductions that we need to see from the transport element of the emissions to tackle climate change. And I'm struck, Adrian, that you rattled off, I think, 4 examples of areas where you get good bang for your buck in the transport space in terms of impact: congestion charging, road reallocation, I think it was a parking enforcement restrictions aspect, and I'm sorry I missed the 4th one that you made. However, my question is, if you feel that the existing plan in the transport side is insufficient, but there are very clear areas of policy which, if implemented, would have a marked impact, why don't you think they are in the plan, and why don't you think the government are pursuing them?
Okay, unfortunately, I think that answer is quite straightforward, but let me just come to it with a bit of background. That one of the things that has been said to you before in other sessions is one of the problems for all of us is that there's a lot of vagueness. There's not a lot of detail in the plan. We don't know what the authors of this report, who have they consulted. We don't know some of the thinking behind why they have put things in and why they have not put things. In terms of the interventions, yes, we do, I would say in research, we do know of the best interventions, and there are officers up and down the land working in transport that know what the best interventions are, and some of them work inside the Scottish Government. The issue, I fear, is that it is the forthcoming election, and there is a reluctance to put your cards on the table to show that we might need to do restrictive policies, because the history of modern road transport in recent decades, particularly in this last decades, has been a fear of backlash particularly through social media and the right-wing press, that these things are seen as restrictive and damaging, and that you'll lose votes. So I think, unfortunately, my reading of the document is that it has almost like had the stuff in and it's been taken out because the emphasis needs to be put on things like words like encouragement, which I referred to as appearing 50 times in the document, where the words restrict, restrain, and similar do not appear if you wanted to do an audit of the words used in documents. So that is my answer. I think it's to do with the run-up to the elections, and if this wasn't a year of the elections, we would see a different document.
Okay. So, Rachel, can I turn to you? Because you also mentioned earlier on a range of evidence-based policy options that could be pursued. And if this was the Health Committee looking at an issue, you would expect our health service to follow an evidence-based approach to the type of actions it takes to address a particular issue or conditions. Why, in your view, do you think that the climate change plan on the transport side doesn't necessarily follow the evidence-based and the actions that you would take in order to reduce transport emissions?
Yeah, thank you. And I also am a little bit nervous about second-guessing motivations and processes. But I think one kind of well-known factor is that it's, you know, the appeal of the technical fix, the idea that, you know, electrification, for instance, is going to solve all the problems, is going to be easy. You know, that's the evidence suggests that that's not true, but it appears to be easier than like doing controversial things like reallocating road space or expecting people to change their behaviour, communicating communicating about the trade-offs. You know, some things will be harder, but there will be substantial benefits as well. So I think that's one thing. And also, I guess a failure to grasp on behalf of many of us that just the scale of the change that is needed. That, you know, for instance, when I saw mention of free buses, I thought, oh, there's going to be free bus. And then I was like, oh, that's just the kind of existing types of limited concessionary schemes. And I think the fact that we need to do, the evidence suggests that we need to do, as Adrian says, so many different things at once, but it's very easy for you know, people to sort of focus on one of them, and often the one that's not you know, that difficult apparently, like encouraging or like technical change and so on. But actually we need to do a lot of things at once, and I think kind of understanding that, communicating that, accepting that, funding that is a challenge. But one would hope that kind of plans such as this would lead from the top and would say, look, there is a lot of change that is going to be required, and you know, we will support this change.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Michael. I think, Monica, you've got some questions now. Sorry, I've got so many papers in front of me when it comes to this plan. I'm not quite sure which one I'm looking at the moment, but Monica, you're definitely next.
Yeah, thank you, Convener, and good morning to our panel. So I have a couple of questions that are, I suppose, mostly bus related, just to give you advance warning. And I'll maybe start with Rachel, if that's okay. It's just to hear from you what policies and practical actions have been proven to get people to use the bus rather than drive, and how could these approaches be supported through the climate change plan, and particularly those that would work best in a Scottish context?
Well, thank you for the question. I would say my expertise is more around walking, wheeling and cycling than around mode shift to public transport, but I could say a little bit. I could say that, you know, as with the active modes, it's really a case of providing a service that competes well with the car. So that's a case of push and pull policies. That's, you know, but they often go together as well, particularly in congested urban areas. So if we're going to be producing, you know, creating priority routes for buses, which I think is very important, then that will have to come from somewhere, and it shouldn't come from pedestrians or cyclists. It needs to come from reallocating space away from private motor vehicles. I think I mentioned free bus travel earlier, and I think the evidence suggests that that doesn't produce a massive shift to the bus, but I think it is important for just transition reasons, for reasons of signalling. A lot of these things as well, it's important to signal what the priority is. So I wouldn't necessarily say that making bus travel free will produce a massive shift to the bus, but I think it will help, and I think it will signal the importance of buses. So really it's a question of making buses a lot better, a lot more reliable, a lot more affordable, and also making sure that they compete very well with the car. And I think if we look at the example of London and the mode shift that London has had towards the bus, we can see you know, a kind of virtuous circle. When the congestion charge was implemented, a lot of that funding went towards buses, went towards improving buses, went towards diversifying the customer base of buses, went towards making buses more affordable, and that produced a substantial shift, helped produce a substantial shift away from the car and towards bus use.
Thank you, Rachel. That's helpful. Because your expertise is largely on the active travel side, I just wonder if there's anything you would want to add in terms of, I suppose, a more holistic approach to this, because often I hear from people that one of the barriers to using public transport or to walking and using active travel mode is how people feel about their personal safety, about their safety in the community at various times, but particularly in the hours of darkness. Is there anything you could say around policy in terms of how we can improve the public's confidence about using not just bus, but if you're using bus, you're probably relying on walking to and from bus stops. So is there anything you can add to that about your work or research?
Yes, and I think sort of you know, freedom to travel safely from you know, risk of harassment, risk of crime, you know, fear. Social fears are really important as well to consider and need to be sort of mainstreamed into part of the process. And I think, you know, a good example of that being done in the cycling area is in terms of in London, where the cycling route assessment incorporates not just traffic safety, but also personal safety and factors that make people feel more safe travelling at night. So, for instance, you could put a route through a park or a housing estate, but that is not going to be perceived as being safe by many people, particularly perhaps women recruitment of people from minority groups after dark. So sort of, I guess, mainstreaming that into planning is really important. In terms of like the specific measures on buses, I'm less, up on the research on that, but certainly ensuring that that is part of the planning that is seen as equally important to other things. Yeah.
Thank you, Rachel. If I can turn to Adrian now, just in terms of those policies and practical measures that help people shift from using the car or driving to bus.
I'd like to defer more to Sarah, actually, but I will say, I mean, there are examples. There was the controversial busgate in Aberdeen, which increased public transport use considerably after it went through, and that's one of those challenges of the benefits realisation that you often have to go through a period of social media backlash when we're trying to put in measures which we know on the evidence are likely to be beneficial. But I come back to the overall emphasis on almost at systems level. You need to have a city, town, whatever, which has a bus route network with a rail network, if there's a railway line, which is integrated, and which there are priority measures very clearly, so that drivers in cars sitting in the queues will see the bus priority happening. It won't be immediate that people start to switch. There'll be other things that might need to happen as well, including the price caps and other things. But we need to be able to show very clearly that the buses work. And again, there are lots of measures, and the measures from the Sustainable Travel Towns is a case in point. They made sure they had proper integrated networks with priority throughout the system, including through urban traffic control, which is the online network which gives signal prioritisation to buses, and they extended those to make those more efficient for bus use across the city. And it's a moot point that no city has ever tried after that trial to do the level of implementation across bus use and other measures on sustainable transport, and that is largely because the funding isn't there, and because the funding that does come is 1 year, which is one of those points we eternally come back to the problem of very short timescales where officers at local authorities and probably in the regional transport partnerships as well are unable to plan for the longer term, and these things need planning over long periods of time, and we just don't have that in the transport field.
Thank you. And Sarah, really keen to hear your recommendations.
Yeah. Yes, I think I agree with a lot of what you've said. Just to build on, the point at the last one we obviously have this year, previously went the Bus Partnership Fund, which was paused and then went away, but came back in the form of the Bus Infrastructure Fund, and I'm very much hoping that we'll see the Bus Infrastructure Fund in the budget later this month, another year's funding for that, which hopefully then we build upon to get back to the kind of multi-year thing, which I think is what both councils and bus operators want to see. If bus operators, they can match in kind. If you've got a kind of multi-year commitment, you can be more kind of ambitious, whereas there's nothing wrong with the Bus Infrastructure Fund, but it is being spent, councils are having to get, out the door, and it's what can we spend it on this year? That bus stop needs fixed, whereas if they kind of had the guarantee of kind of 3 or 4 years funding, it could be a more ambitious piece. And yeah, I think I agree with Rachel, in terms of kind of free bus travel, it can kind of increase the number of bus trips, but it doesn't seem to kind of take away from the car trips. So, for example, year one evaluation of the young persons scheme, it did show that some of them were taking less car trips, but the number of car trips hasn't gone down overall. So are their parents still taking the car? They're just not in it, and they're getting the bus to the football or whatever. So I think, yeah, careful evaluation of schemes like that to see it's free. Is it really linked to modal shift, or is it more kind of on the cost of living side? And the same would be true of things like rail fares, peak rail fares, that sort of thing. But multi-year funding for bus priority, you've probably heard us say it 1,000 times, but that's what we think is really important.
Well, it's definitely on the record again today. Sarah, I wonder, and perhaps Adrian as well might have a view on this, an issue that's been quite contentious in my region, and I cover North and South Lanarkshire, has been school transport, because many councils had already changed their policy to, I suppose, stick to the sort of statutory minimum, and the two Lanarkshire councils had kind of held out for a bit longer until they felt they could no longer afford to do so. But there's lots of families, young people have been affected by a reduction in free bus travel to school, which has been a little bit confusing at a time when we've got the extended concessionary travel scheme for under 22s. Thinking about, I suppose, behaviour change and normalising the use of bus, and thinking about, you know, not just about the distance that children and young people have to travel, but, you know, they've often got bad weather, they've got equipment, musical instruments and so on. So we're hearing it's becoming a real concern for families. Is there anything more could be done, you know, given that, you know, we do have a financial envelope to work within, but, you know, if we were making it easier for children and young people to be able to get to school on the bus, would that help to normalise the use of public transport in that way? I don't know. Adrian's looking at me.
So, well, I mean, I've just come to you from health psychology, really.
Yeah.
That one of the things that's really important is habit. I mean, we're creatures of habit. So one of the things whether we're talking about physical activity or whether we're just talking about routine behaviours otherwise, if we start positive habits early on in life, they are likely to carry through to us. It's called tracking in the science. So if we get young people to be able to be normalised into using the bus as a normal everyday activity, then yes, that's really important for the longer term. We know, for example, just to take something from physical activity research, we know that children are physically active when they're young are more likely to be physically active when they're adults. It's kind of like it gets in your DNA and it stays with you as you go through across the life course. The same can be true for habits we learn early on in life about using buses. It is not an unusual thing to do. It's quite socially normative, so we start using that term about social normativity, which is what we have to do to make not using the car socially normative, rather than looking at your neighbour and seeing that they get in a car every morning and that's therefore affects your own thinking. So we need to see people going out and getting the bus and using buses as socially normative in that way. But, of course, we can say that as much as we like, but there needs to be the bus service and there needs to be the frequency of the bus services going to the right places at the right time. So it's a combination of the structural stuff as well as the habit. So the habit is really important. So it is critical that we get children to be able to travel by public transport and also by walking and cycling. Obviously, that's part of it. And in urban areas, there's more opportunity for that with things I'll just mention, school street closures, which essentially are where you just close the roads for time-limited period pre and before the start of the day, and it makes it safer for everyone to be able to travel around. Residents are still free to drive their cars in and out, and that sort of thing, people with blue badges, etc. So there are a number of ways, but buses, habit, really, really important from early life.
So on that, Adrian, would you recommend then that the climate change plan needs to include more around incentivising, I suppose, the use of buses for that early years school demographic? Is that something that could be added into the plan?
Well, it will. The convener will come back to me and talk to me about costs because they don't come cheaply. But what we do know, and Sarah's touched on, is there has been the most positive effect from the first year review of the free buses for 5 to 21-year-olds has been that the biggest change has been a reduction in parents carrying their able-bodied children to school because they're now able to go on the buses. There's also been a small reduction in children walking because if there's a bus coming, they'll get on the bus instead of walking too. So there are some downsides, but nonetheless, that's a good intervention, although it costs a lot of money. But sometimes we need to be brave to put those levels of funding in because we need to look at it over the long term. We don't have a long-term picture at the moment. We can look abroad to other countries where they've done this, and you've seen over the years usage has gone up as people become... This actually affords me the opportunity to say one of those things that behaviour change is really hard. Human beings do not like changing their behaviour. Yeah, we're creatures of habit. So when you put in new infrastructure, whether it's bus use or for walking or cycling, particularly in this context of today, the research says it can take up to 2 years for people to change their behaviour. They think about it and do it. And if it involves buying a bicycle, you know, that's an extra set of things than thinking about how I get to work or whatever it is. You know, it doesn't happen immediately. It takes time. Human human behaviour is subtle and nuanced, and so if you're trying to get new behaviours or instill them, you have to think about this over a long-term period. The difficulty is we're talking about a subject where time is short, but nonetheless there is still time to ingrain habits from the earliest to get children to be able to travel healthily, but it does need support from government, and that includes local government.
Thank you, Adrian. And time is always short on committee, so I'll move on to my next question and possibly just come straight to Sarah on this one. The committee's previously heard that traffic congestion and its associated impact on bus service reliability and knock-on costs is the key challenge facing the bus industry. So I'm interested to hear, does the plan include policies or proposals that will tackle this issue? And if not, what would you like to see included in the plan?
Yes, so as I say, yeah, you've heard us speak about this before. I don't know if you saw just before Christmas as well, there was a really good BBC piece which profiled a bus route in Edinburgh, just showing you kind of the impact of congestion on passengers and sort of really brought it to life. Yeah, I think there are policies and proposals in there. They'll just need a bit more detail. I said earlier I wasn't very clear in reading it if it was a kind of, the intent was to introduce a new bus infrastructure scheme, or was it to keep going with the current bus infrastructure fund with some tweaks. I think it probably will change the way the kind of the funding is kind of allocated at local authority level. So just a bit more detail, but yeah, I'm really encouraged to see it in there. And I would love to see it move from proposal to policy to make it a bit more concrete. But yeah, I think we've got all, as I say, CPT has a lot of kind of evidence. We can show you the kind of like the impact, and we've modelled it a lot. Published another report last year that just showed, it was actually quite modest increases in speed could, generate millions more journeys, just a few more miles an hour if we can get buses moving that bit faster. And that's the sort of things, I suppose, as Adrian was saying, if motorists can see that and appreciate that and understand that if they are paying a charge, whether it's in terms of time or actual cost, that is where it is going into that. It's not just going into a kind of an anonymous government or council pot of money that they don't know where it's going. It's a communication thing, isn't it? This is what you're spending and this is what you're getting as a result. So you might want to consider using the bus because it'll be faster.
Okay, thank you. Unless there's any further comments to add from the panel, I'll hand back to you, convener.
I think the deputy convener wants to follow up on this subject area. Michael.
Yeah, thanks. It's maybe a question for you, for yourself, Sarah, given that your members benefit the most from this, as those who are bus operators. So, in this financial year, the Scottish Government will spend £414.5 million on its two concessionary travel schemes. And within the draft climate change plan, on the issues around transport outcomes and seeking to reduce car usage, one of the key policy areas in which to help to achieve car usage reductions is concessionary fare schemes, both the older persons and the under 22s. Is there any evidence that the £414.5 million that's been spent in this financial year it has any impact whatsoever in reducing the amount of car emissions?
So I think I probably touched on that earlier when I was talking about there's been one full year evaluation of the under 22s scheme, and I think there's one going on at the moment of the older and disabled persons scheme. So it doesn't seem to have reduced car usage, no. But it is one policy as part of a kind of suite of policies, and that's what I think we kind of have talked about before. It's important to not say, well, if we give people free bus travel, that'll sort it out and they'll all take the bus instead of using the car. It needs to be part of a package of measures that include bus priority and potentially disincentives to using the car. So in terms of what you're spending on concessionary travel, no, it isn't making people use their car less. But as the government talks about it, it's a cost of living measure as well. It's not just a kind of a transport spend, if that answers your question.
I recognise there are wider societal benefits from having something for free in that sense, but being specific about the draft climate change plan. So, as a policy as it stands on its own, there is no evidence from what you're saying that it actually reduces car usage. Is that correct?
Well, not that I can see, no, but we've had it since the start of 2022. And as far as I'm aware, car use in Scotland has not reduced since the start of 2022. So if you're drawing a link between the two, yeah.
Okay. And can I turn to you then, Adrian, just given the important element of behaviour change in trying to create modal shift, concessionary travel can play a part in helping to support modal shift. But if we don't have that wider range of policies which act more of a stick to get people to make use of it, then in effect it becomes quite a blunt instrument with quite a high price tag attached to it without any real, from a climate change perspective, real benefits being gained from it. Do you think there's a sufficient suite of other interventions wrapped around the concessionary travel scheme elements to create the type of behaviour change that you think is necessary in this draft plan?
So I will repeat some of the things I've said before. I think that concessionary travel is important, but on its own, it's certainly not enough. And if you're looking for the effect of a single policy measure to show you a reduction in car use, it's very unlikely, unless it's something like congestion charging. There are some lighter and some more heavyweight stuff, congestion charging, which is in the plan. It's discussed very briefly 4 times, 3 of them in a context of legislative measures. That would be a more extreme end. But what I've said a number of times, particularly in the context of the Sustainable Travel Towns, which demonstrated clearly that you need to have a package of measures which are synergetic, that support each other. So those will be fiscal measures as well, but there will be measures on carriageway, which may be protection of bus priority measures, as well as the other measures for various measures for walking and cycling. So it's a synergetic property of all of those together. One on its own won't do. And the problem with the draft plan is that it focuses on encouragement. So I'm just repeating myself, but I think it's really important to understand that encouragement may be a good thing, but on its own it ain't enough. It really simply isn't enough. You have to do the things which are potentially politically unpalatable, and there lies the rub, because we need to put restrictions on car use in urban areas where people have alternative choices, not in rural areas where people don't really have alternatives, but in urban areas where large mass of Scottish people live in urban areas. And this is where the opportunity lies. So you have to do carrot and stick. I don't like using the word stick because of that the sense it gives you, but it is that you need demand management, to use the phrase. You need demand management as well as the encouragement side. You can't do one without the other, and you certainly need the demand management, because otherwise concessionary fares schemes will not be able to show you that you've got a reduction in car use, because it's simply not a strong enough measure on its own. There are, just to finish, there are psychosocial aspects to this. And what I mean by that is people use cars and own cars because there are psychosocial attachments, which means that the value of a car is more than the sum of its utilitarian properties. They value cars because it gives them status. They value cars because everyone else has got one around them, and we are birds of a feather that like to do things that others do. It's socially normative. Cars have more than the sum of just the use that they get of them. The motor industry wouldn't pour millions of pounds every year into advertising if there wasn't. So we need really strong measures to push people away from car use. We're not trying to punish people. We're trying to make a world which we can survive in, where temperatures don't go skyrocketing the way that Kevin Watkins was talking about it. So we need to have measures which push people, as Rachel used the phrase, towards public transport that is available, that is effective and efficient, and the same would go for walking and cycling. And just to finish, I'd like to say that of the two between walking and cycling, a lot of money gets pushed and attention gets pushed to cycling, and it is important. There are lots of cardiovascular and other benefits that come from that, the co-benefit stuff we talk about. But in terms of a population level, and I'm a public health doctor, so I talk about population health, walking is absolutely critical. It's the thing that virtually all of us can do. We can get out and walk to the bus stop if there's a bus stop and all the rest of it, but we can do that. So we need to put a lot more effort on making the environments conducive and supportive for walking. pavement parking ban is important where it has been put in. No denying that. In Edinburgh, it has been a game changer, certainly in my experience. So I just finish on the fact that walking is really, really important in all of this. Thank you.
Thanks.
Just to put some figures, Sarah, before I go to Mark with the supplementary, just looking back at the information we've got, I think when I started in this Parliament 10 years ago, the cost for concessionary travel was about £193 million a year. We've now heard it's gone up to £414 million a year. Actually, in that time, kilometres travelled by cars appears to have gone up considerably. Very difficult to put an exact figure of it, maybe up to 1 billion kilometres, according to Transport Scotland, and that trips by buses have dropped by 150 million trips by buses. So it's a very expensive way, £200 million, to get more car kilometres travelled and less bus trips done. Would you say, therefore, it's a poorly targeted intervention?
As I've said, I think, as I've said a few times, concessionary travel is about more than just modal shift. It's, about a cost of living measure, I think, is how the government would present it.
If you have access to the modal shift of buses in your area, which I think Adrian suggested might not be the case in rural areas so much. Mark, anyway, you want a supplementary?
Yeah, I think the context of COVID is important there, convener, as well, in terms of... Oh, good, everyone's nodding.
Well, that makes it look even worse if you add COVID in.
So I'd like to go back to the point around, standalone transport policy interventions. I mean, concessionary travel for young people has been hugely successful for young people. It's really opened up opportunities, created a lot of socio-economic benefit. But I'm struck by what you're saying, that individual transport policy interventions on their own are less successful and they need to be blended and integrated together. I'm interested in how that works financially, because there are questions, I think, within this climate change plan about how much is it all going to cost? How can we raise revenue to effectively invest in supporting particular policy interventions like concessionary travel? So I'm interested in what the evidence shows around, the particular demand management, congestion charging, policy interventions that have been taken, which have then resulted in investment in positive interventions, which give people something for free, but effectively it's not free because it's being raised through congestion charging or demand management measures. And I guess the challenge then of how do you ensure that those policy interventions are positive, where people are getting reductions or free travel, are able to be rolled out in advance of any demand management measures being put in place. So there is a choice from day one where you have free and accessible travel rather than having to wait 5-10 years for funds to be built up to enable you to build an extra tram line or to make another policy intervention that kind of levels the playing field. Does that make sense? Can I kind of invite a couple of comments on that, and maybe start with Rachel and then I'll come to the room.
No.
Yeah.
Unmuted, yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think obviously, in terms of examples that are relatively close to home, London is a very good example of the congestion charge being introduced, and then, as I was saying, the funding going towards improving bus services, making them more affordable, making them better, making them more reliable, and also pedestrianisation schemes. That was the other big beneficiary of the congestion charge funding. I would say, given how urgent, as we've been talking about and people have talked about previously, how urgent the situation is, how substantial the need for change, I would be wary about waiting until new tram lines have been built to institute the demand management policies. I think that there are many things that you can do at the start. For instance, in London, things around changes to bus pricing could be done sooner than some of the other bus priority measures that involved large changes to the road environment. So I think it's what I often see in terms of active travel policy and interventions is that people say we can't do X before Y, we can't do Y before Z, and nothing gets done because it doesn't start anywhere. But I think clearly I agree there has to be that commitment to doing all the things, but they are not going to all be done at the same time at day one. So there have to be always mitigations. I mean, all these policies will have potentially, undesirable impacts in various ways, thinking about, for instance, social equity, so ensuring that those things are thought about, and even if everything can't be in place at day one, there's an understood and communicated commitment to do something about them, to build that tram line, even if it's not going to be in place on day one.
Okay. Adrian?
One of the subject areas we haven't discussed, but is mentioned at least twice in the plan, is what's been actually called workplace parking licensing. It doesn't say workplace parking charging. I think that word charging again, of course, causing offence to the authors, so they kicked it out. But nonetheless, we only have one workplace charging example from the UK, which is Nottingham, which has proved to be successful among different commentators and based on the evidence. And what that does, what that does is it places a charge if you have more than 11 parking spaces in your business in the central area. It puts that money, the charge, the cost, to a central levy, which goes to improve public transport, and that has been put to enhancements to Nottingham's main railway station and to bus services across Nottingham City, and as well as towards the construction of tram lines. Now, tram lines is longer term, so picking up on the point, Rachel's point about needing to do immediate things. We haven't had any movement on that in Scotland, despite the fact that background work has been done for making that available to the local authorities. It's not a cure-all, but it would be useful as a measure. If I go back to my referring to the sustainable travel towns, what was really interesting, one of the really interesting points, and I will steer you to a Transport Research Laboratory report in 2015 by Sully Cairns and Marcus Jones, which was being 5 years post-intervention. It's unusual that we get these reports that are able to look at a relatively long-term intervention and see what happened after the money dried up. And they found there was a halo effect. And what I mean by that was, even though the funding levels went back to the pre-levels before the government funding arrived for the Travel Town trial, people maintained their travel behaviour largely in the way they did before. They stayed with buses, and more people stayed with walking and cycling. Hasn't been gone back and monitored subsequent to 2015, so it'll be interesting to see. But it does mean you can get habits to start to stick, to get back to the point we had the discussion a bit earlier. So I think there are some valuable lessons to learn from what evidence is out there about multi-pronged interventions, Mark, particularly that there is a value, not least in that there can be a halo effect, and there's a value from schemes which give money that can be allocated across a number of different measures as per Nottingham. Thank you.
Sarah?
Yeah, only to say that I think I was sort of just sketching out, but I suppose you could see a role for kind of national government in providing the kind of initial funding for bus infrastructure, sustainable transport, but then an expectation that the council or local authority, as part of their plan for car use reduction, then sets out, well, you're getting this money now, but how will we raise it in future to keep this going and build upon it, that sort of thing. So it's a sort of that's what the role of national government could perhaps be, the sort of start-up and the kick to get it going, but with an expectation that as part of your plan you will set out how you are going to disincentivise and reinvest, so you get the kind of circle going.
What do you anticipate the benefits will be from the fare cap scheme that's being rolled out in Highlands and Islands?
Yeah, so obviously very early days. It was announced just before Christmas, a couple of days before Christmas, where it would be. So we had a very quick call with Hightrans just before Christmas on that, and NZ Transit will also be as well. So I think, it's all to be discussed. I think we're very light on what will be in scope, which services, if they're going to cross-border, kind of, because you'll get services going from Glasgow to Inverness kind of thing, will they be included in it? So I think they just, very careful evaluation of it. I think we've talked about this before, that it's, looking at the scheme and who's using it, what journeys is it being used for? Are people taking longer journeys? Is it local journeys? And it'll give a base for potentially doing something in the future. But yeah, is it just maybe people just using it to take a coach from Glasgow to Inverness to do shopping, or is it more kind of individual journeys? And if we find it is like lots of little individual journeys, maybe a £2 fare cap isn't actually the best thing, because if you're making multiple journeys, a sort of day ticket type thing or integrated ticketing is a better option. But it gives an opportunity certainly for like a massive part of the country to see what the impact is. Obviously, England has had £2 fare cap for a number of years now. They've not done a huge amount of evaluation of it. And I suppose if you look at the kind of annual stats, bus journeys in England haven't gone up considerably as a result of that, but they are in a different position in not having the same concessionary schemes as us. And I think the initial finding of it, it was younger people were perhaps benefiting most from the £2 and now £3 fare cap there. But overall, yeah, again, it was more of a kind of cost of living measure introduced by the previous government than a kind of modal shift one,
okay,
but with the hope that it would.
Thanks, Mark. The next question has come from Bob. Over to you, Bob.
Thanks, Convener. I'm going to stick on some stuff around concessionary travel and other investment into bus service. I know we've discussed that at length, and some facts and figures about investment have been put on the record as well. I just note that the main ways money is leveraged in is to the concessionary fare scheme, £414 million. We've heard that already. The bus infrastructure fund modest at £20 million, but it's established, and we want to see multi-year funding and a long-term commitment to that and network support grant. I'll just go back to one of those figures that the Convener was mentioning, again, £414 million for concessionary travel. Now, that is a 67% real terms increase in funds for concessionary travel between 2006, 2007 and 2023 and 2024. But only seen a 13.5% increase in concessionary travel trips taken. There seems quite a sizable disconnect between the investment and the amount of trips taken, even though it's all desirable. So if we add all this money together, the quantum together, is the money working in the most effective way it possibly can? Is there other ways to spend that money? How could we see that money better used or better deployed? So that's a very open question. I think it makes sense to go to Sarah first in relation to that.
Yeah, I think that's possibly more a question for the Government and Transport Scotland than me. It's very difficult to take something away, isn't it, once you've conferred a kind of entitlement. So if you look at the kind of total money, yes, probably, if you could possibly do, but I'm not suggesting taking away concessionary travel.
Could we drive a much better deal with the bus companies? Are bus companies getting quite a significant amount of public cash but they having to do very much in return?
Well, the concessionary travel scheme operates on a principle that they're no better or worse off, as you'll know, probably from sitting through the kind of order every year when we kind of work out the
I certainly do know that's the theory, but that's certainly the theory behind it.
Yep.
Yeah.
I mean, you mentioned the Bus Infrastructure Fund and then also Network Support Grant. I think, again, we've probably drawn your attention to this, that the Network Support Grant rate hasn't increased in over 10 years. And it's, particularly, it's not just large bus companies we're talking about here. There are, hundreds of smaller bus companies. Community bus operators can claim Network Support Grant as well. So the fact that that hasn't been uprated in many years is really a big thing. And that's something we'd probably want to see more money go to that.
I'm focusing yourself, but I think the wider issue has been well explored with other witnesses. If that was to be uprated, should government, should local authorities, should strategic transport authorities be getting something back for that uprating? Or do we just uprate it without any conditions on that?
Well, I think you would uprate it to match current costs in terms of things like, fuel, energy, labour costs, driver costs, that they have all gone up over the years. But I think local authorities are getting something back, aren't they, in terms of the journeys that those bus companies are carrying. A lot of them are kind of, subsidised routes by local authorities, so they're providing an essential service. Ms Lennon talked earlier about school transport. We are seeing in some areas a kind of transfer of the kind of journeys to school onto kind of like more commercial services rather than the kind of ones that the statutory have to carry under the Education Act, and that's something kind of to keep an eye on as well. I think Transport Scotland have reissued guidance on school transport just to make sure that local authorities aren't doing too much of that, kind of just saying you've got a bus pass, now you can just get on that bus to school rather than the kind of actual service that's contracted to take people.
Okay, and I do want to come back and ask you some more questions later, but do any other witnesses have any comments to make in the quantum of public cash that's going into bus services, mainly through the concessionary travel, but not exclusively through, about how that could be best used, tweaked to get better outcomes or more desirable outcomes? If there's not anyone wanting to anything on the record, that's fine, but now would be a good time to do that. So we're all comfortable with that investment. It's all going as intended. No concerns over, and I'm not trying to create an issue that's not there, I just want for clarity, no concerns over a 6 to 7 real terms increase in money to concessionary travel, but only a 13.5% increase in trips on concessionary travel.
I mean, I'll just say, it's a repeat of what's been said, that we have to think about the wider societal impacts of this, that they go more than the actual travel in itself. Transport is a derived demand. It's there to enable people to do goods, to do other things. And if we don't put those things in, if we don't have concessionary fares, we'll have more people missing hospital appointments for a start, etc., etc. And then you get into false car ownership, where people decide they need to buy a car, they can't really afford to run it, and they cut back on other things in their budgets, in their household budgets. So it is complex. I think I'd leave it at that.
Okay, thanks. Witness to misinterpret my questions as being not supportive of all of this, but it's my job to interrogate whether we're getting it right, the spend that we are making. Sarah, can I come back to yourself? I know it wasn't yourself that said this, but there's a perception out there that I might just challenge slightly, that the easiest way to get the biggest reduction in car usage is where the services exist currently in large urban areas. That might be true, but that might be the most substantial investment. As a non-driver with a family and a regular bus user in Maryhill and across to North Glasgow, I well know the congestion on the routes on Maryhill Road, Great Western Road, Dumbarton Road. I know the game we play about looking at the interactive timetable for when the bus is likely to appear. Oh, it's 5 minutes now, it's 8 minutes now, it's 7 minutes. Getting clogged up at Cowcaddens or on Byers Road and Queen Market Drive and all these other areas. So, and I also know these buses are bursting at the seams when they do arrive. So the first thing that probably has to happen in these large urban areas is improving the quality of the service for those already using the service, because I suspect if we got a modal change from those in cars, out of cars to those services, they would use it for a short period of time and then not use it again. So any comments, and this might take us back to the infrastructure fund, I suppose, Sarah, but any comments about how we get services running well, first of all, in large urban areas, before we talk about that being the game changer for getting people out of cars? And is that a reasonable picture that I would paint of some people's experience in large urban areas using buses?
Yeah, I mean, it echoes my experience again as a non-car driver in Edinburgh. I was held up by some roadworks this morning. It's not just other cars, it's roadworks is a big issue as well. I suppose, you're talking about you do something, but people only do it for a while and don't continue the pattern. Is that the sort of behaviour change? That's the concern you have, that the investment goes into something, but it doesn't result in...
I suppose my concern is that the first tranche of investment would be to improve the service for those already using buses who, as I will probably tonight, have to stand on a bus to get back to my home from Glasgow city centre because of capacity issues. I don't actually believe in bus companies. I know finances are tight and it's not easy just to magic up a new bus service. It's not one bus, it's 4 buses to complete the route and additional drivers. There's significant costs. But is the first step getting it right for existing users before we can realistically talk about getting it right for people to switch from car to buses?
Yeah, I suppose that is a good point, making the bus user the kind of advocate to sell it to other people. One thing that we, when you were talking about kind of talking to children about their school travel choices, was actually maybe talking to their parents as well, or other adults or teachers, and how what are the journeys that they're taking? How are they making them? Is there something that's making them not keen on using the bus? Is it kind of the lack of journey planning, just a bit unsure, because they can be the greatest advocates for kind of, the next generation as well?
I'll move on. I've got the opportunity to put in the public record what I think is important in urban areas, and for my constituents certainly, convener. So the next thing I want to ask about was about how the Scottish Government can rethink its policy on the development of a new car reduction target and policy. We know that the previous one was abolished. It was not seen as realistic to achieving. There's a kind of interim, I think 4% reduction put out there, but it is actually developing a new, more substantive policy, is my understanding in relation to this. And I was going to come to Professor Davis in relation to this. Now, you've put on the record already all the push factors, if you like, about how to get that modal shift from car to other forms of transport, including active travel. So I won't ask you about that, but what would a realistic target look like? And if there's any push factor you haven't put on the record yet, Professor Davis, now would be your opportunity to do that.
Well, looking at what other research in recent years has said, 30 to 50% reduction in car use or car mileage has been cited many times by CREDS, which is the UK Energy Demand Solutions Service, which is a consortium of universities, by the Elements Energy for the Scottish Government, which is where the original target for Scotland came from, and by others. I've got on a bit of paper in front of me. So they all come up with roughly the same area. That's kind of triangulation. It's suggesting it's that level of change we need, not 4% per year. So there's something awry with the calculations, which leads me to the point of where does this come from? Where does this writing, where does this change come from? Why have they decided on 4%? As I've alluded and others have alluded, the writing is really vague about this. We do not have evidence. We know that AECOM did a study of demand management for the Scottish Government, which looked at road pricing in quite some detail, and that is not really mentioned at all, apart from one footnote in the document. So there's a lot of information out there, and I'd like, before the end of this session, to be able to at least put on record that there are a lot of people with expertise inside and outside the Scottish Government who would be able and willing and would like to help the Scottish Government in the drafting of the final plan, albeit that time is very tight. Yes. But they've not taken on board the expertise which is available to them, I suppose, is my point.
So I think you have just got that on the record, so job done there, I think. I'm not supporting nor denouncing the 4% policy, but 30 to 50% seems at odds with the Climate Change Committee, which I think recommended a 6% reduction. I suppose my question was, Professor, what you think a realistic reduction?
Well, yes, there's a thing about...
So not the reduction you would wish to see, but what you think a realistic, practical and deliverable reduction would be.
And that is what the latter of the Climate Change Committee was focusing on, more on the realistic, rather than what Kevin Watkins might actually say is what we actually need. And that's a sad point for the planet, probably. So I'm not quite sure how much more there is to say than we need to revisit that target from the draft plan. There is at least time to reconsider that before the final document is published, but there needs to be more detail for readers to understand why that figure has been decided upon. It's just not clear to us why, what the background to that is.
Okay, so I think that's helpful. That is important to put on the record, but I also want to misinterpret your comments, Professor Davis. Were you suggesting that whilst you would like it to go far further, you think that 6% is a reasonable and achievable reduction?
Well, personally, I think we need to do more. So there's this difference between what we might have to accept and what the science tells us we need to do. So I feel very uncomfortable about saying 6% is enough. 6% is better than 4%, but we're still off target. And in years to come, our children and grandchildren, if we ever get to that stage, will lament why our generation did not take the action when the science was very clear.
Okay, I think you're answering a different question from the one I asked, but,
Okay.
but you have put that one on the record. Final question, I suppose. Is there a contradiction somewhere down the line where we're trying to incentivise the use of, and this for all witnesses that want to come in, incentivise the use of electric cars, EV cars, but at the same time want to reduce car usage? So at one hand, we're trying to promote the use of low-carbon vehicles, but in another hand, we're trying to get more people to drive certain types of cars. Is there a contradiction there? Is there anything the government has been mindful of in its strategy in relation to this?
Is that a question to me?
I'm looking at the screen as well.
Yeah, sorry.
So does anyone want to come in? Maybe perhaps one of our witnesses has not had the opportunity to contribute yet, if they wish to.
It's you wanting to come in, but you're being given the opportunity before Kevin comes in with the next question to contribute to this. Does anyone want to come in? Sorry.
Yes, sorry, I think we can't unmute ourselves, so it just takes a minute. Yeah, I would say that I referred to at the start the need for policies to restrict the growing size, the growing weight of cars, and I think it is a problem if, as in a document like this, the focus is very much on electrification, that you do have these unintended consequences which have already been found to be happening in Scandinavian countries, which are ahead of us in incentivising electric vehicles. The risk is you just get people to drive more, you get them to shift from public transport to car use if you are making it easier to drive electric cars and not making it harder to drive more generally and not sufficiently improving alternative modes. So I think this is a potential contradiction, yes, and in relation to, because it links to the point about reducing car use, even I would very much agree that, 4 to 6% reduction is not enough. It will still be very hard. And, getting a 4 to 6% reduction in car use, you need a clear plan. You need to be laying out where it's going to come from. You need to monitor different parts of the country. You need to be checking, very regularly what is happening. Is it going in the right direction? So, even that is going to be very difficult. And I think that's why we need very clear targets, very clear monitoring and, action regularly to make sure where are these reductions coming from? Are they happening? If not, what more do we need to do? But there is, even a relatively small reduction in car use will require substantial change, which is why the contradiction point is kind of worrying, I would agree.
Okay, thank you. Now, I have no further questions. If any witnesses want to come in to add to that, grand. Otherwise,
Okay, well, I think Kevin's waiting patiently to come in on this. So, Kevin, over to you.
Thank you. It wasn't necessarily on this point, but there has been a number of comments made around about habit. And I think that during the course of our scrutiny of the climate change plan, I've made a number of points around about this is all about delivery. And in order to deliver, we are going to have to change habits. And I think some of the folk have stated today that we don't like change. Human beings don't like change. But sometimes we can sow change if we can get things right. What I want to ask is around about some of the delivery aspects, and Busgates in Aberdeen was touched upon. And there was a social media backlash. There was a backlash. Many folk were unhappy. But the reality is that some folk were unhappy because they felt that they hadn't been listened to around about what was required. Do we have a situation whereby we could put too much into the plan itself without allowing the flexibilities that would allow for the change and make habit change easier? And maybe if we could go to Professor Davis first, because I think he was the one that was talking most about habit.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, habit, as I mentioned earlier, is really important, and where habit is stronger than intention, you don't get change. So we often have intentions to change our behaviour, like in New Year's resolutions, but they often fail. So we mustn't belittle and misunderstand the importance of habit in human behaviour. But there are nudges we can do. Many of us would have heard of nudges. The number 10 unit used to be one of those places that talked about nudges, that we can help people to make small changes. It's important to think that if you could just, for example, not use your car one day of the week and use the bus instead, that's a 20% reduction. If you did that across the population travelling, that would be the 20% reduction you're looking for already. So these things are important. Small changes, when done at a population level, can add up to big changes. So we should, I suppose what I'd like to just restate is, picking on the question, is we should take account of these things from social psychology about the importance of things like habit. There's other things like anchoring and other aspects which I won't go into. But habit is really, really important in travel behaviour. There's a lot of literature about how you can change habit by doing some changes and releasing people. For example, when people move house, we've seen quite a few studies looking, people move house so they can change their travel behaviour, which is quite an interesting thing in itself, because they don't want they want to travel more sustainably, for example. Now, that's a big thing to do just because you want to change your travel behaviour. So most people are not going to do that. But we do know that there are ways to try and ameliorate some of the effects of habit where intention is not on its own strong enough. So some nudges by the state at one level or other, which might be fiscal or could be changes to bus route and frequency, etc. And some marketing, because we haven't talked about marketing, we haven't talked about social marketing, how you market for social good, could be used to give people more incentives to change some of their behaviours, which at a population level, yes, can lead to significant changes in overall population travel behaviour.
You missed out one part of the question, and that was about listening to people. Now, as we've all agreed, it's difficult to get folk to change, but it's easier to get people to change if they feel that they have been listened to. How do we do that better in terms of making sure that we deliver?
So I did touch on by just using the word social marketing, and which is about communication and explaining why you're doing things, the background to it all, and it's not just for the fun of it. Is really important, and we've seen at national levels across governments elsewhere in the UK the failure to do this. So I'm going to cite now from Wales the 20-mile-an-hour implementation, which was done on one day on September the 17th, 2023 in Wales, where despite being given a social marketing strategy to try and to explain a national conversation with the population of Wales, the government chose not to use that approach. We do need to have conversations, which means it's a two-way street, listening to the public. I absolutely agree with the points. I'm with you absolutely on that. We do need to listen to the population because we need to alter some of the things that we prior to thought we might have done, and then develop a good strategy which includes a lot of good comms work out there to get messages across to society to explain the rationale for why we're doing these things. That's not going to cut off all of the social media backlash that you're inevitably going to get these days, but it is important. Thank you.
Professor Aldred, please.
Yes, yes, thank you. Now, I would like to add something on the importance of engagement, because this is something that has also been affected by the limitations of funding, the short-term funding, and this is one thing that I found very much in studies in England, that there isn't the staff to meaningfully engage often with residents. There isn't, people are taken on for a short period for a project, then there's not the ongoing sort of participatory involvement that is needed. So I think that is a problem. I think I've seen examples of where this is done well. I've seen examples, for instance, around traffic reduction in neighbourhoods. Research suggests that you don't need the greening in order to get the traffic reduction, but that people want the greening, and that there are various things that people want that make it easier to implement, that make it easier to get acceptance for traffic reduction measures. There are also good examples that I've seen where local authorities have adapted schemes once they're in place in response to potential concerns, in response to requests for improvements. So yeah, there are good examples, but it does need resourcing. And I think when there were cuts and austerity in local government, it was very easy to think, well, we won't get rid of the engineers, we'll get rid of the consultation engagement people. I think that was a big mistake. So I think there are ways to do this better. There are good examples, but it needs resourcing.
Again, the strong message from today is that the Treasury needs to get this right and come up with multi-year funding instead of the current single-year funding that most of us, including the Scottish Parliament, Scottish Government, get. Would that be the view of yourself, Professor Aldred?
Yeah, I think long term, we need a lot more funding certainly for active and sustainable travel, and it needs to be sustained. It needs to be multi-year in order to give the best chance to make the transformative change that we need.
I don't know if Ms. Collier wants to come in here.
Just to say that I agree with a lot of what's been said, and you made the point about flexibility, Mr. Stewart. Like, bus is a very flexible form of public transport, and bus priority doesn't need to be about digging up and making bus lanes. It can be as simple as using technology and AI, traffic signalling, and giving it a go, see if it works, and if it doesn't work, you can try something different. So it's a flexible form of transport, and a flexible bus priority can be a flexible solution as well.
I have a question specifically for Ms. Collier around about bus companies. In terms of formulation of routes, should they listen to passengers? And do you think that that would make a real difference in terms of patronage? Because I do.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think many of them do. There are kind of guidelines for community engagement that were part of the bus task force a couple of years ago that were developed. Maybe we could give them a bit more of a kind of reminder that they exist, but certainly I think people do. And I know there are plenty of online forums where people are making suggestions about how routes could be altered and changes that could be made to them. And I think bus companies do genuinely listen to those, and if something isn't working, they do make changes.
I'm not so sure about that, Ms. Collier, but maybe you can help us and try and get more of them, including first in Aberdeen, to listen to their customers and not always dictate that they are right, when quite often I think they're probably cutting off their noses to spite their face in terms of the amount of folk they get on buses. I've got a question for Mr. Solomon as well, convener, because he seems to have been.
I'm afraid, Kevin, it will be your last question.
Indeed, and that is around about how do we get to a point, Mr. Solomon, in terms of logistics, where we actually match up the opportunities of rail, sea, water, and road freight transportation. And do you think that the UK government and the Scottish government has done enough in this area to see how we can do better in all of this?
Yeah, I guess just to give a bit of context, the support for modal shift must reflect operational reality of where we're at. I guess while at Logistics UK we do support modal shift to rail and water where it's viable, these are really only appropriate for certain flows and commodities. So a lot of freight journeys, particularly that first and last mile movement, will continue to rely on road transport. So I think when we look at modal shift, it should be seen as a complementary tool, not a substitute for decarbonising road freight. And I think that's where you start getting the benefits, where you start looking at it as a holistic solution rather than a substitution. And again, I think logistics is not a very cash-rich sector. That most operators operate on a profit margin of 1 to 3%. And again, that modal shift is not always commercially viable for all operators, especially those that are SMEs. And again, 99.7% of the sector are SMEs. So again, I think if you do want to incentivize that modal shift, it's about ensuring there are schemes and support available, number one, in terms of infrastructure to facilitate that transition, but also in terms of that revenue support. And like I mentioned, a lot of the revenue support has been pulled back. So it's all well and good having ambition, but if you don't have the funding mechanisms to support that ambition, you won't get that because it's just not commercially viable for a lot of these businesses.
Okay. Thank you, Convener.
Which is a neat move to the Deputy Convener with his questions on this subject.
I want to turn to the issue of decarbonisation of freight and the pathway to achieving that. The climate change plan places a large amount of the transition to decarbonising freight on the decarbonisation of HGVs and vans. I think there's probably steady progress being made in the van market from my personal experience, but not so much in the HGV sector. Can I ask you, Mr Solomon, what number of HGVs operating in Scotland or across the UK at the present time electric? And what does that pathway to the electrification of the HGV sector look like operationally over the course of the next 10 to, say, 20 years?
Yeah. So I don't have the exact number in Scotland, but at the moment across the UK there are 600, I think, working eHGVs across the UK. I think our members' concern, I think, is the fact that the technology maturity is not at the place in which perhaps aligned with where the regulations or legislation is expected to be, because again, it's all well and good having these electric HGVs, but if there isn't the parallel infrastructure to charge them, and that is particularly difficult in Scotland, where there isn't much charging, in particular for HGVs, there isn't power capacity. And again, there is a concern around payload. So again, there is a payload penalty where, because electric HGVs are heavier, it means that operators are carrying less load. And if they're carrying less load, they're making less money. And already on tight margins, when you're paying double the price for a HGV, you're paying more for electricity, then you're also making less money because you can carry less. It's that misalignment between perhaps where the regulation is and what operators are expected to do and still be commercially viable. I think what we talk about a lot of Logistics UK is looking at alternative pathways. So again, what we talk about is low carbon fuels, and they should play a more important role in reducing emissions, and I think in particular in the near and medium term. But essentially what they do is they act as a viable solution until perhaps the technology maturity is there for electrification. But essentially there isn't a lot of talk on that in the plan, and essentially what low carbon fuels allows or facilitates is that pragmatic pathway for freight decarbonisation alongside electrification. So it's not in opposition, but essentially it acts as that pragmatic solution where you can still use the existing diesel vehicles, but you use them as dropping fuels and you get up to 80% reduction. And those act as a really good support in the meantime until that technology maturity does catch up.
Okay, so I'm taking from what you're saying there, 600 vehicles, it must be a very small percentage of the overall fleet in the whole of the UK. I would have thought in single digits percentage-wise, is that correct? Yep. And I'm also taking from what you're saying is that largely the HGV sector doesn't feel as though the existing technology available for electric HGVs is mature enough to offer them or to be an attractive investment for them to be able to meet their operational demands. Is that correct?
Yes, I think it's important to note there are some the operations of logistics vary differently, right? If you're doing regional deliveries or parcels, etc., perhaps there are some routes which can be electrified. If you're doing regional deliveries or back to base, those can be electrified. I think the sector is seen as a blanket, and there are very different operational realities on that. So if you're doing long haul, if there is a trip perhaps from Edinburgh to the East Midlands Gateway, for example, that would be very difficult to electrify because there wouldn't be the appropriate infrastructure to charge along that route. So I think it's if electrification is going to be pushed. It's about looking at certain segments and looking at perhaps where that low-hanging fruit is, rather than trying to approach electrification as the whole for the sector, because again, it is very diverse and the movement and flow of goods, it does differ depending on what you're moving.
Okay. So your final point was, I think, that you feel that that a more pragmatic and realistic route for the decarbonisation of HGVs is for the use of alternative fuel types, low carbon fuel types, such as drop-in fuels that you mentioned. For example, you're talking about things like HVO being used as an alternative. Is that the type of thing that you're referring to?
Methane, bioethanol, biomethane, HVO, and other alternative low carbon fuels.
So the issue, just take HVO in itself. My recollection is, I may be wrong here, is that all HVO in the UK is actually imported from overseas. There's none of it manufactured in the UK. Do you know why that's the case?
Previously, it's because there hasn't been a lot of, and this is actually something we lobby for, and we've got a paper out on this actually, is that there hasn't been a lot of support for domestic use. So again, it's just a competition. We're being outcompeted internationally for domestic supply. So there isn't that support that there is internationally by those international governments to support the production of HVO.
Okay, so if the objective of this draft climate change plan is to reduce emissions from things like HGVs, then it'd be more pragmatic to look at drop-in fuels as opposed to electrification, which feels a bit of a pipe dream at the present time. But the problem I've got is that using things like HVO is effectively offshoring by importing fuel as opposed to making stuff domestically here in Scotland or the UK that could actually be used as a drop-in fuel. But there's insufficient government support for that. Is that correct?
Yes, and there are domestic suppliers of bioethanol. There is biomethane that is domestically produced also. So there is a domestic supply of low-carbon fuels that can be used also. So it's not just the HVO that is internationally imported that can be used.
Okay, therefore, would you like to see in this draft climate change plan some indication from the Scottish Government on how it's going to help to support the use of alternative fuel types such as drop-in fuels as part of the HGV decarbonisation plan?
Most definitely, because I think it facilitates that transition. Because what's happening now is because the technology isn't there at the moment, a lot of operators are doing nothing. So rather than waiting for that technology to catch up, they can be having up to 80% emissions reductions now by using some of these alternative fuels. And I think it's that obsession with zero when it comes to net zero, but actually what we should be looking at with freight in particular is that wider decarbonisation, just having that downward trajectory. And that is the approach the EU is taking at the moment, where they're not looking at or focusing just on the zero emissions vehicles, but looking at a downward trajectory of emissions.
Okay, that's helpful. My final question is on freight onto road to rail. At the present moment, there is obviously there was grant available to help to encourage freight operators to shift on to rail, and I'm conscious that there are limitations as to what you can put onto rail freight in terms of good types. Do you know exactly how many rail freight pathways are available within the rail network in the UK that are not being utilised because of a lack of demand from industry to switch on to using rail freight?
No, I wouldn't know an exact number on that.
Do you know if that information is available?
I can check and follow up with you, but it's not something I've seen in my role.
I think it would be helpful to know, just given your expertise in logistics, because if we're trying to encourage people to put freight onto rail is what capacity is there available that's not been utilised, and what can we do to actually try and incentivise its greater use? Because if we haven't quantified, because there are limitations to how much freight pathways you can have on the rail network, but if we don't understand exactly how much is available, it's difficult then to understand how much we might be able to incentivise people to make use of it.
No, most definitely. I'm happy to follow up after this session. We do have a modal shift lead within the team as well, who may be able to support and provide information on that.
That'd be very helpful. Thank you.
Before we leave this, I've just got a question on, obviously, it's good to get freight onto rail. One of the issues is you can get heavier containers, as I understand it, onto railway lines than you can onto lorries. And there was a move, I think, in some parts of your industry to have a 48-ton for 48 miles, i.e. to allow them to offload a container and take that to a depot to be split down and broken up for normal use. But it requires a coordination, because that obviously exceeds the UK road limit and would desperately compromise the UK road limit if it was an electric vehicle. So do you think there needs to be more thought on this whole process so that we can use railways more and encourage freight companies to use it as a means for taking bigger parcels to break it down for distribution onwards once they get to a hub like, say, Inverness or Glasgow? Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, most definitely. And I think it goes back to the primary point I made about actually this shouldn't be looked at as a substitute, but rather a holistic complementary tool. And I think when that shift happens is when people or operators or companies and businesses look at it as how can this complement my operations rather than replace. And I think that's when you start looking at solutions like you've mentioned about having sections of routes or fragments of routes and then looking at what the end route looks like. Because it goes back to my primary point where although we do support modal shift, we need to look at the operational realities of actually the majority or a lot of freight will still be moved by road because of the last mile or first mile.
Okay, and sorry, just one further point is I was interested in your cost for HGVs. Electric HGVs are, I think you said, double the price of normal ones. So, you know, we're talking about in excess of 300,000 to maybe 150,000 for an HGV. And that once you get it and your electric HGV, you then have a huge amount of downtime every time you've finished using it to charge it back up again. Is electric HGVs at the moment a pipe dream, and are drop-in fuels, as the Deputy Convener suggested, a better way of doing it?
Yes, so, and it's not only the vehicle you're paying for, you're going to have to pay for the charging infrastructure, you're going to have to pay for the connections upgrade, and you're also going to have to pay for the electricity as well. So the TCOs at the moment just don't line up. So sorry for those that don't know the total cost of ownerships. So how much you pay for the vehicle over the period just don't align for electric and diesel vehicles at the moment. So yes, I think it's about looking at what is the pragmatic solutions of what we can do now while still decarbonising, but in a way that is both realistic and deliverable for businesses and commercially viable. And I think low carbon fuels are a great option where you can still decarbonise, but they are still commercially viable for businesses.
Okay, thank you. Douglas, I think you've got some questions.
It was on rail freight, Convener. I think we've covered it already.
Okay, Mark, you wanted to come in briefly.
I just wanted to go back to a previous point. I just wanted to ask Sarah, because it's been raised this morning that bus patronage is struggling to get back to where it was pre-COVID. It's struggling to kind of make that significant modal shift. Is one of the issues here for bus companies the amount of road congestion ostensibly caused by private cars in urban areas? Is that a reason why some services are being reduced?
Yeah, I mean, new services are being introduced. It's not all kind of downward. We are seeing new services, intercity routes, that sort of thing. So it's not to say that, everything's being cut. There are new things coming in and refined. But yeah, congestion, you can model it. You could run a service maybe 3 times an hour if there was less congestion, but you're now currently only running at 2 times an hour. So that's definitely, I mean, it's not just, I think you've probably also heard us say, it's not just about competition from cars. Roadworks has been a massive issue that our operator members have pointed to. And I think action on that and coordination of that also needs to be a really important part of the local authorities, their car use reduction plan. They need to take that into account. Also things like parking enforcement, I think, would be raised as another issue. So
increasing car use affects public transport. It reduces the amount of public transport services that are run in urban areas. Is that right?
Yeah, or it reduces the possibility for more services to be run. It's not that the kind of numbers going down. It's just there would be more potential for, you know, an extra service an hour, that sort of thing, if the road was clearer to get it through. And as I say, we are talking just like incremental here. It is just a couple of extra miles an hour. If we can get them to run that bit faster, could result in those millions of extra journeys.
Yeah. Anyone else want to come in on this? Adrian Davis, do you want to come in briefly?
I mean, it's only just to pick up on the point of it's about roadworks. It's Sarah's point about roadworks earlier, that we're likely to see increasing levels of roadworks because of road wear and tear, and that will be due to heavier vehicles on the road. And I'm referring to the switch to EVs. EVs often mean, well, people move from roughly a 1-ton vehicle to a 2+ ton vehicle. That's 16 times more road wear per mile because of the weight and the impact on the road. That's not often understood. So when people talk about roadworks in the future, you need to understand that some of this will be you're driving a much heavier vehicle and it's tearing up the carriageway, and that needs to be factored in because it's going to be a long-term cost in terms of asset management for local highway authorities who will need to repair it when the money could go elsewhere, of course, and need to repair it far more frequently.
Okay, Rachel, do you want to come in?
Sorry, I'm muted. Yes, I just thought there was an important linking point there, thinking about the first mile and last mile of freight deliveries as well, because we haven't, I mentioned it earlier, but we haven't really talked about the potential to shift some of those last mile and first mile to e-cargo bikes, which are obviously a lot lighter, have a range of different co-benefits and so on. And in European cities, there's much more use of e-cargo bike for first mile and last mile deliveries. And in London, you can start seeing a shift. Transport for London have got an action plan for this. I recently just got through a report on the use of, there's an Undercroft under Waterloo station that is starting to be used as a hub for last mile delivery by e-cargo bikes. And this is something that is becoming, increasingly desirable, increasingly efficient, because when the streets are more designed around sustainable transport, then using e-cargo bikes becomes, has more of a competitive advantage, but it won't just happen. And those kind of repurposing those spaces and support to provide and repurpose those spaces so that those e-cargo bike deliveries can happen is really important. So I think that should be part of the plan too.
Thanks.
Okay, and I'm afraid my time has run out as far as this session. So I'd like to thank you all for attending this morning and giving your evidence. And the committee will now suspend till 11:10, where we'll take evidence from the second panel this morning on the government's draft climate change plan. So I suspend the meeting. Thank you.